The Fool Soldiers. This is from the usdakotawar.org. I'm going to read a few articles so you get a well-rounded idea of what happened with the Fool Soldiers. On August 20th, 1862, Dakota warriors attacked a group of settler families fleeing from a small community near Lake Chetek. And when the fighting was over, 8 adults and 6 children from Lake Chetek were dead, as well as several Dakota soldiers. 3 women and 8 children were taken captive by Dakota men. The captives were taken north and west into Dakota Territory, where they were split up among several Dakota families with whom they traveled for months. On November 20th, the captives were released to a group of young Lakota men known as the Fool Soldiers, who had formed 2 years earlier with a pledge to follow a path of nonviolence. The Fool Soldiers traded their own horses, blankets, food, and weapons for the captives. Left with 2 rifles, a teepee, some blankets, and a horse, the Fool Soldiers and the captives began an arduous journey that ended up at Fort Randall, a U.S. military post on the Missouri River. The Fool Soldiers were imprisoned once they reached the fort. Before they were released months later, several had died, and the captives' lives were shattered. Laura Dooley, who had lost 2 sons in the ordeal, returned to Minnesota with her daughters. She was reunited with her husband William, and the family moved to Alabama and eventually to Washington. Julia Wright, who was raped during her captivity, was pregnant when she returned to Minnesota. She was abandoned by her husband after giving birth. The remaining children, Lily Everett, Roseanne Ireland, and Ellen Ireland, had lost their mothers in the fighting. They were reunited with their fathers after their release. So that's one article to give you an idea about the Fool Soldiers. And then I wanted to read 2 other ones from different accounts or perspectives. This one is The Wisdom of the Fool Soldiers, and it was in the South Dakota Magazine by Michael Zimney. And he wrote it on February 6, 2019. In the winter of 1862, 10 Lakota warriors risked their lives and reputations for a novel concept. The rights of civilians during wartime, people called them the Fool Soldiers because at a time when being indigenous made them targets, they staked a claim for militant humanism, even if it meant alienating some of their own. If they'd expected medals or accolades, the appellation may have proved apt, but the available evidence, the mostly forgotten stories told by descendants and historians, indicates another motive. They just wanted to do good. The Fool Soldiers' leader was a man named Charger, later angelicized as Martin Charger, who was said to have proven himself in war, but who strove for peace, first in intertribal conflicts, and then between Dakota and Lakota and Euro-American rivals. According to Samuel Charger's biography of his father in 1860, a young man named Kills and Comes Back received a vision and approached Charger to discuss its meaning. The dream as related by Samuel Charger seems abbreviated, more like a postscript. He wrote that Kills and Comes Back had seen 10 stags in his dream, all black, and as he advanced toward them, one in the lead spoke to him. It said, "This vision is to be fulfilled by you, and to be compiled with you by all who are members. You and every member is to be respected and feared, and you must be united in your undertakings." As the dreamer looked closer, he said he identified himself as the one who was speaking. What did the black stag, who was Kills and Come Back, show himself? Charger held a council to divine its meaning. Kills game afterward interpreted it to mean that the members should be 10 in number and that to be respected by the tribe they should be generous not only with food but with their property. Charger agreed as well as did all the others. The following night the young men shared the dream with Charging Dog, a man of the same character of Kills game, also a medicine man of fame throughout the tribe. Charging Dog reaffirmed the other's interpretation. As a medicine man, I do not always get riches, But the good I do, my fellow tribesmen, is something to strive for. We may be brave in battle, but as everyone knows, we do not live long, and to each other harm in our camp is very bad. I have seen a lot of it during my life, and I believe the hardest thing for anybody to do is to do good to others, but it makes their hearts rejoice. So they organized a society based on those principles, and in August of 1862, Dakota people at Upper and Low Sioux Agency of Minnesota were brought to the brink of starvation. They'd been hit by famine, and the annuities the governor owed them were late. When agency store owner Andrew Myrick was reputed to say, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung," Myrick was killed on the first day of the Dakota War. You know how the lives blur if you've been there and what happens next. Civilians killed, reprisals that kill more innocents. That's how it was going on August 20th when a band led by White Lodge attacked the tiny settlement of Lake Chetek near present-day Curry, Minnesota, killing 15 settlers and taking 8 captives, 2 women and 6 children. When news traveled to Charger and the Fool soldiers that White Lodge and his band were camped and with their captives on the west side of the Missouri, they saw an opportunity to live their commitment to the vision. They left their camp near Fort Pierre, traded horses and pelts for the food they could offer as ransom, and set out for White Lodge's camp. As they crossed the river, people were said to implore them not to go. They thought the boys, as they called them, would not come back alive, wrote Samuel Charger, and the undertaking was foolish, but Charger told the crowd, "There is only one life, and that is short, hence we should do what we think is good." According to the South Dakota historian Doan Robinson, the band included Charger, Kills and Comes, Forebear, Mad Bear, Pretty Bear, Sitting Bear, Swift Bird, One Rib, Strikes Fire, Red Dog, and Charging Dog. Along the way, they encountered a Yankatanas camp where they were told the White Lodge's band was camped near present-day Mobridge. As the stories tell it, White Lodge did not warmly welcome the Fool soldiers. Negotiations were tense and could easily have degenerated into shooting. In the end, White Lodge's son, Black Hawk, agreed with the Fool soldiers and helped them secure the hostages, the 2 women and 5 children. One child had died, and they weren't victorious yet. They had to trade all their horses and provisions and had a 100-mile journey ahead through blizzard conditions with a group of ragged, hungry children. As they started back, they received some help from Don't Know How, a Yanktanas man who may have traveled with them to White Lodge's camp or met them coming and going. He furnished them with 1 horse and helped them fashion a travois to carry the children. Don't Know How was the paternal grandfather of the great Dakota artist Oscar Howe, who depicted the Fool soldiers' rescue of the late Chetek captives in one of his murals at the Sure Howe Arena in Mobridge. And that is this picture right here that you're seeing. Don't Know How's kindness helped, but the Fool soldiers still had to complete a journey akin to Washington's crossing of the Delaware to make it home. Seeing that Laura Dooley, one of the 2 adult female captives, was barefoot, Charger is said to have given her his moccasins, wrapping his own feet in old clothes. The group camped only twice, walking through the 3rd night, arriving the next morning at the river where several traders helped them make a treacherous ford of the river, which wasn't wholly covered with ice. From there, a trader named Charles Primo housed the freed captives until the U.S. Army returned them to their relatives. A monument recognizing the Fool soldiers stands in Mobridge City Park. Then the Fool soldiers' story faded into obscurity. They had set out to do good and succeeded. If they had harbored any less selfish motives, they would have failed. Fool soldier Joseph Forebear didn't benefit from his actions, said his great-granddaughter Marcella Lobo. He signed the peace Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, and he had to live on the northeast corner of our reservation and not leave. If he'd had left, he'd have to have signed a permit to come and go. Otherwise, he would have been shot as a hostile. They gave him land allotments on the reservation. That was already our land. That was treaty land. What kind of sense is that, to give back his own land to him? He had to live there. And he had to live by that peace treaty, so he didn't dance Indian. He didn't follow his own ways. He didn't hunt for his people and provide for them like he did in the past. So my thought is, if you can't be who you are, Then who are you? So he lived out his life like that. Were the fool soldiers misguided in helping the captives? I believe they did a good deed, LeBeau says. Joseph Forebear did receive a token of posthumous gratitude. On his tombstone, a white marble tombstone, it said something about he was a friend to the white man for over 70-some years, LeBeau says, and I know that his own people didn't have the funds to do that. There is also a modest quartzite marker in Mobridge, which you're seeing right here. It says the Shatak captives rescued here November 1862 by full soldier band. In 1996, Paul Carpenter, a descendant of one of the rescued captives, brought gifts to the descendants of the fool soldiers and honored them in a ceremony. There was standing room only in that building, LeBeau says. People lined Main Street and reenacted scenes from the rescue. Martin Charger giving Laura Dooley his moccasins, wrapping his feet in rakes, the children transported by travois, pulled by their single horse. The tribute, 134 years after the event, raised some awareness momentarily. I think in school they should learn about it, LeBeau says, but I don't think that's happening. I know when I went to boarding school, we didn't learn anything. The fool soldiers were revolutionaries. While their own people were steadily losing their land and way of life, they took a stand for people who looked like the enemy. 87 years before the Fourth Geneva Convention codified civilian wartime rights, including a prohibition on taking civilian hostages into international law. The reasons they haven't been recognized probably range from the obvious, they were Native American, to the thornier issue of their acceptance within their own group. Their own people, some of them were against them, LeBeau says. The fool soldiers may be perceived by some as capitulators, and any recognition of them may in kind be seen as an exclusive endorsement of their response to the times in which they lived, like the epitaph on Forebear's tombstone. Their act, though, is not a negation of the survival strategies of warriors like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull. Rather, it was the antithesis of Custer's attack on civilian camps or the massacre of disarmed non-combatants at Wounded Knee. The fool soldiers have been called pacifists, but Samuel Charger's biography of his father depicts them not as pacifists, but warriors turned militant humanists. Martin Charger and his men are the moral forebears of Hugh Thompson and the American girls who stopped the massacre at My Lai and others like them. Decades later, Thompson and his men got their medals. On March 16, 1968, they didn't know if they would make it out alive. That's how it's always going to be for a fool soldier. The conventioners can call for Twister as a means of conflict resolution if they want. Wartime ethics live or die on the barrel side of the White Lodge or William Kelly's guns, what the nations codified as Lac Le Mans. The fool soldiers lived on in the Mine Sos, their greater monuments to lesser men. And then there was one other article I wanted to read, and it is from Native American History. Magicalchildhood.com is the website. Native American History, learn the story of the fool soldiers. One of the most moving events in American history has all been lost to our history books, the heroic journey of the fool soldiers to rescue a group of women and children during the Minnesota Uprising of 1862. The Minnesota Uprising, also referred to as the U.S. Dakota War and the Great Sioux Uprising, took place in August of 1862. Patty E. DeCory summarizes the events in the Fool Soldier Band. Miles to the east in Minnesota, the Santee were reaching their breaking point in August 1862. They had suffered crop failures the previous year and hence nearly starved during the 1861-1862 winter, and now their annuity goods and cash were late. As they impatiently waited, they petitioned the traders for credit, which was denied, and provided one of the most famous quotes of these contentious days. Storekeeper Andrew J. Myrick said, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass." He did not live to regret these words. The Minnesota Uprising of 1862 began innocently enough with some returning hunters, some broken eggs, and a dare. By nightfall on August 17th, 5 white settlers were dead, and the Indians were gathering to assess their situation. Although several of the chiefs are said to have been against the uprising, the young braves could and did go counter to their wishes. Once the decision had been made, the chiefs, although reluctant, felt that they had to go along with their people. The events culminated in tragedy at a settlement on Lake Shatek. On August 20th, the uprising arrived at Lake Chetek in Murray County in southern Minnesota. The settlers unsuccessfully hid in a swamp later known as Slaughter Slough. After shooting at the moving grass for several hours, the Indians called out the women and children, offering them safety. By the next afternoon, Santee Chief White Lodge and his band were headed west with their 8 captives, Mrs. Julia Wright, Mrs. Laura Dooley, and 6 children. In November, word of the captives reached a group of young Teton Lakota men. These men had formed a group based on nonviolence and helping all people, leading some others to mockingly call them the Fool Soldiers. The Fool Soldiers decided to make the journey to the Santee camp to negotiate a trade and rescue the hostages. Since they believed in nonviolence, they gathered and bought supplies like blankets, coffee, and sugar to offer in return for the women and children. The Fool Soldiers made the dangerous trek to the camp and spent 3 days negotiating for the release, and when they finally succeeded, they were left to journey back with only 1 horse. The others had been added to the trade in bitter cold and snow. They had very little clothing and few supplies for either themselves or their rescued captives. The Fool Soldiers carried the smallest children and put 1 injured woman on their only horse. 1 soldier gave his moccasins to the other women because she was barefoot. They were later able to trade a gun for a cart to put the children in, but it was too heavy for their horse to pull, so the Fool Soldiers took turns pulling it themselves. The journey was dangerous as they had to be on guard against those who considered them enemies from all sides of the conflict, including U.S. forces who might see them as kidnappers, and they were also battling brutal cold and ice. They succeeded, though, and returned the captives to Fort Randall. Following the rescue and a later rescue of starving Lakota on Medicine Creek, they were not greeted as heroes by either side of the conflict. When they arrived at Fort Randall, they were imprisoned by the U.S. until the end of the conflict, and it is believed that the 2 of them died while in the stockades. Once released, they were ridiculed and shunned by many in their tribe, and their log homes were whitewashed. They eventually relocated to other areas. Life was difficult for some of the rescued women and children after the rescue as well. The story is told in a DVD, Return to Chetek, The Courage of the Fool Soldiers, through the voices of both the rescued captives and the young men who risked their lives to bring them home. It's difficult to find the video now. Our family has a copy that we purchased locally at a Lake Chetek State Park since we live near the site of the conflict. It can be ordered in Minnesota through interlibrary loan and may be available through libraries in other states as well. Be aware that parts in the beginning may be difficult for young or sensitive children. Barbara Britton has written up an excellent 5-page discussion guide to go along with the DVD. The guide asks questions such as, why do you think a child is narrating the story? Why were White Lodge's people not welcomed in South Dakota? And what were and still are the 4 basic rules of the Fool Soldier Society? Respect, compassion, responsibility, and accountability. Unfortunately, I am no longer able to find this study guide online. Please comment if you know a place to find it again. There are several southern Minnesota sites you can visit with kids to accompany your studies of the Fool Soldiers. One is obviously Lake Chetek State Park, the original site of the settlers and captives and the site of one of the original cabins. A memorial also stands there for the men, women, and children who did not survive the attack. There is a monument at Slaughter Slough, which you can learn more about here. And this article has links. Families can also visit Fool Soldier Band Monument in Mobridge, South Dakota, and the Minnesota Historic Society has quite a few books to learn about the U.S. Dakota of 1862. Harry Charger, a descendant of one of the original Fool Soldiers, talked about his family's history at the dedication of the Curry Monument. He talked to the crowd and said some Native Americans are still bitter that the Fool Soldiers helped the settlers. Minnesota Public Radio reports his words. We're still being ridiculed to this day. We're being called traitors. We're being looked down upon a lot of times, said Charger. But we stand tall because, like I said, if you have compassion in here, there ain't no force in the entire universe that will beat you. A scholarship fund now exists for descendants of the Fool Soldiers to attend college. The fund was created by the ancestors of both the Fool Soldiers and the families they helped rescue. And what eventually became of the Fool Soldiers? Those who survived continued their work. A.B. Welch wrote in the Welch Dakota Papers in 1924. Lewis and Clark in 1804 mentioned that they heard of a band of Sioux warriors whose solemn oath was that they would never turn back from any danger or give way to their enemies. In 1864, the band of fool soldiers among the Tetons had but 13 or less members, and a new member could not be elected until there was a vacancy and was much sought after. Some of the members of the famous Soldiers Society have been as follows. Juanita Charger, a grandson of Captain Lewis, not the Juanita of the Sissetons. This man died in 1900. His wife died at Devil's Lake in January 1916. Kills and Comes, Swift Bird, Four Bears, Mad Bear, Pretty Bear, Sitting Bear, One Rib, Strikes Fire, Red Dog, and Charging Dog. These men all achieved fame early in life. The descendants of these famous men of brave and spectacular deeds are living today on the Standing Rock. Famed Dakota artist Oscar Howe's paternal grandfather, Don't Know, D.K. Howe, was also a member of the Fool Soldiers Rescue Party. Harry Charger, who worked tirelessly to carry on the positive messages and legacy of the Fool Soldiers, died in 2015. Thank you for listening.